All right, so in this webcast, we're going to be looking at cellular respiration, just kind of an introduction to the idea of what it is and the fact that we need to use ATP and what that means. And what happens to ATP and why do we have to keep making ATP all the time? So the first couple of questions to consider: define cellular respiration and outlining the use of ATP is basically what I'm going to cover. Well, also I'll introduce you to the idea of that there is such thing as anaerobic and aerobic respiration. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to open up this PowerPoint, I think. There we go. Okay, so let's look at cell respiration. First of all, our first focus is ATP because that is necessary for cells to do work. Okay, so ATP is the energy that gets used by cells to do cellular work. And we make ATP all the time, and the energy that we need to build the ATP, because we're going to essentially take the food that we eat, right? And we're going to turn that, so the food that we eat is essentially chemical energy, right? We're going to break down that chemical energy in food to help use that energy to build ATP. And then ATP can be used to do cellular work. That's the currency. That's the voltage that's necessary to drive cellular work. The hamburger that you ate doesn't just drive transport across the cell membrane. The cell membrane only pays attention to ATP. So we can't take glucose, or we can't take, a long fatty acid chain and have that talk to your cell membrane. We actually need ATP to be doing that talking and the energy currency, because that's the only energy currency that your cells are going to respond to. So we have to take the food that you eat and we break that down and release energy from that to build the ATP, which is the energy currency that your cells will recognize, okay? And there's two types of cell respiration. You can see under here, there's aerobic and anaerobic, right? We do both, and plants do both. All the eukaryotes can do both because they have mitochondria. Bacteria tend to only do, a lot of them do mostly anaerobic type respiration, but there's some who can use a little bit of oxygen too, but it's not the same. Okay. So now, as I said, ATP is what powers cell work, okay? And all living organisms use ATP for chemical transport or mechanical work. So if you want to run your sodium potassium pump, you remember we had to learn how that worked? You have to use ATP to get that to happen. So if you want to pump sodiums out and potassiums in, then that takes an ATP, okay? And what happens is the ATP, which this is what the ATP looks like. It's essentially kind of like a nucleotide, right? There's a ribose, and then there's this adenine, and then there's 3 phosphate groups, triphosphate, right, attached to it. Well, what's going to happen is the bond between these 2 phosphates is going to get broken, because the molecule that we're giving the energy to is going to be phosphorylated. So this ATP comes, and this phosphate here will be what attaches to that cell membrane so it can open up the sodium potassium pump, and then that will be released eventually, okay? So that's this triphosphate will donate a phosphate. It will phosphorylate whatever cell molecule it's trying to energize, which gives it the energy it needs to do the actual movement or the actual transport of things. And so to do that, that ATP gets broken down into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate group, okay? And what we have to do in cell respiration is we're going to rebuild this into the ATP again so it can keep getting used, okay? And what's going to power that building of this into this is the food that you eat, okay? So here's kind of the cycle. Here's the ATP that gets hydrolyzed, and the cell will be phosphorylated, so it's got the energy it needs to do that cellular work. So the ATP will will phosphorylate a cell, and it will be able to transport something, move something around, whatever that may be, okay? And then essentially what you end up getting from that is you get an ADP and a P. We've got to rebuild those. So you can keep doing work. You want to continually transport things across membranes. You want to be able to move. You want to be able to, whatever is necessary, fire those neurons, right? And so we've got to take all that ADP and P that's left over from doing work and rebuild it to ATP. That takes energy. The energy that you have to put into the ADP and P to make the ATP is energy from catabolism, from breaking down the food that you eat. Okay, so when you eat, your porridge in the morning, that porridge gets broken down, you digest it into smaller parts, and then your body your cells will end up taking those smaller molecules, breaking them down, and using the energy from breaking down all those carbon bonds to drive the work it takes to make ATP. Okay, so once the work's been done, cell respiration uses energy from breaking down organic molecules like carbohydrates and lipids to drive anabolic reaction of rebuilding the ATP, right? So it's anabolic because we're building something, the ATP from ADP and P. Okay, so now, when the ATP is used in cells, right, that gets converted to heat because the heat can't be reused. That's why we have to keep eating, because you can't just take the heat from the ATP turning into ADP and P. So once we use that ATP, heat gets released, and we have to rebuild the ATP, but we can't use the heat that got released to do it because that's not high quality energy. We need food. We need nutrition. That's why we have to eat. That's why plants photosynthesize. They make their own food. Okay. So thinking back to all this and what it means for ecology, we can tie this statement into what we know about ecology, right? So here's our food or our energy pyramid, right? And what are the two main methods of nutrition, right? You have autotrophs and heterotrophs. Well, the autotrophs down here, these guys take sunlight and carbon dioxide to make sugars. And then they use those sugars in cell respiration. They break those down to make ATP. Okay. We just eat food and break that food down to make ATP. They make their own food first in photosynthesis and then break that down. Okay. And since carbon molecules, we know that this is important in part of the process to make those organic nutrients that are broken down to make ATP. That's why the carbon cycle is also tied to all this. So when we look at this carbon cycle, it's like carbon and energy, right? So light energy comes in, plants make food, they make organic molecules. They're going to use some of those organic molecules for their own cell respiration to make ATP. And if you eat the plant, then you're taking those organic molecules to use in your own cell respiration. So the plant is going to do photosynthesis to make the organic molecules, and either they use them or something else is going to eat it, whether it's you or a decomposer if the plant, if the leaf falls and the plant dies or whatever. So all those organic molecules get used. And what we get out of that is ATP, either made by the plant or by the other molecules. And then that gets released, ATP is released, and carbon dioxide is a byproduct. Okay, so that carbon dioxide then gets taken in by the plant. Some light energy builds back to those organic molecules. So this is both tracking energy and the carbon. So you notice that matter is cycling around, the carbon is cycling around between CO2 into organic molecules and back to CO2 again. But notice the energy is a one-way flow. Light energy is going in, and that helps make those organic molecules. And then when ATP is used, we actually lose that energy as heat. So the energy is a one-way flow. So it's flowing through, whereas the carbon is cycling around. Now, last thing I'm going to talk about on this little video is I'm just going to show you, this says which organisms carry out cell respiration. All living organisms do. Plants do too. They have mitochondria, bacteria, everything carries out cell respiration. But whether you are a eukaryote or prokaryote will depend on if you can do the aerobic cell respiration with mitochondria. Okay, so just showing you, there's two main types of respiration. There's anaerobic and aerobic. So aerobic means that oxygen is going to be involved, and anaerobic means it's in conditions where oxygen won't be involved. All eukaryotes can do both. Okay, we can do anaerobic and aerobic respiration, because look, we've got the mitochondria. This is where aerobic cellular respiration happens. But bacteria that do not have mitochondria, they're basically just doing the anaerobic part. They're just basically doing it without, they don't need the use of oxygen to be able to make the energy, but they're not quite as efficient at doing it as we are, because aerobic respiration makes a whole lot more ATP than anaerobic. It's a huge difference. You only make for anaerobic, you make about 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. Here, we make about 36 to 38 ATPs per glucose molecule. And what we're going to do in the next couple of videos, one, we're going to be looking at the process of anaerobic respiration, and another one, we're going to look at the process of aerobic respiration.